Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Molly. If you are new around here, if you've never seen my face before, then hi, my name is Molly and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that's something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe. And don't forget to switch on your little notification bell so that YouTube will notify you every single time that I post. Anyway, today we are going to be talking about a case that is known as the World's End Murders, and it was given this name because the victims of today's case were last seen alive. Well, one of the last places they were seen alive was at a pub called the World's End. And I feel like I say this a lot, but this case really has been on my list to cover for ages now, probably about a year or so. This case is officially solved, however it took years and years of tireless police work to uncover the truth and almost 4 decades for the killer to be brought to justice. So for today's case, we are going all the way back to the year 1977 in Edinburgh, which is the capital city of Scotland. It was the evening of the 15th of October 1977, which was a Saturday, and that night a group of 4 young girls were all just enjoying a night out. These 4 girls were all very good friends, and that night they just wanted to go out and have some fun in Edinburgh's old town. And there were various different pubs and bars in Edinburgh, so it was a really nice area for young people to meet up with their friends and have some drinks. And as I said, that is exactly what these 4 young girls were doing that night. They were on a night out and they were pretty much just going from pub to pub and just having a laugh with each other. I believe they were all aged around 17 years old, so of course they weren't actually allowed to be served alcohol yet, but like most teenagers did back then and probably still do now, they would try their luck and see if they could get a drink from the bar a year before they were legally allowed to drink alcohol. So they had a drink or 2, but none of them were drunk by any means. Eventually that night, the 4 friends ended up in a pub called the World's End Pub, which is located on the Royal Miles High Street, and amongst this group were 17-year-old Christine Eady and 17-year-old Helen Scott, who had been good friends for many years. Christine and Helen had known each other since they were young children, and they both went to the same school, so they pretty much saw one another every single day and they grew up together. Just for a bit of background information about the girls, so Helen Scott's parents were called Moraine and Margaret, and she had 2 older half-sisters and a younger brother named Kevin, and the Scott family were all very close. Kevin described his sister Helen as being very much like a country girl, despite the fact that she lived in the city of Edinburgh. She had such a love for animals, especially dogs, and her family owned quite a few dogs which Helen just adored. And she also really loved children. She loved spending time with children. Her brother said that she just had a passion for things that needed help and support, like young children and animals. She was just a very caring person. Helen was a little bit younger than her good friend Christine. I think she was about 5 months younger, and she was also a bit more timid and quiet, whereas Christine was described as being just the life and soul of the party. Christine was quite a short person apparently, but she had a huge personality. She was described as being very bubbly and vivacious, and she and Helen were very close. And they both just had their whole futures ahead of them. They had so much potential, but their lives were tragically cut short that night in October of 1977. So like I mentioned, that night Christine and Helen were both in the World's End pub, which wasn't the biggest pub. It was quite small actually, and as I'm sure you can imagine, on this particular night, a Saturday night, it was very busy. The place was packed full of people, and Christine, Helen and their 2 other friends were sat near the front of the pub. At some point during the evening, the two other girls that Christine and Helen were with that night got up and they both went to the toilet, leaving Christine and Helen sitting alone. And that was when they were approached by two older men. Now, no one else in the pub really recognised these two men, and apparently they were wearing clothes that were quite different to what everyone else was wearing, not the kind of clothes that were in fashion in this kind of area. So it seemed as though they were not local, they weren't from around here. But anyway, Christine and Helen were approached by these two men and they sat down beside them and the four of them just began chatting. Eventually the two other girls returned from the toilet, and when they did, they asked Christine and Helen if they wanted to join them in going to a party that was happening elsewhere in Edinburgh that night. However, Christine and Helen were enjoying chatting to these two older guys, and so they declined. They decided to stay in the World's End pub, which was a decision that would ultimately change their lives forever. So the friends said goodbye to the girls and they left the pub to go to this party, whilst Christine and Helen continued speaking with the two guys. However, when the pub was reaching closing time, they left, and this was around 10:15, 10:20 p.m. It's believed that they did leave the World's End with the two men because witnesses later described seeing two young girls that resembled Christine and Helen leaving the pub and walking down the high street, and near them were those two older guys. They were kind of accompanied by these two men at a distance, so Christine and Helen were walking down the high street and the two men were not far behind them, so it seemed as though they were all walking together. However, after these sightings of Christine and Helen, they were never seen alive again. They were last seen walking down a street called St. Mary Street, and after that they just disappeared. The girls never returned to their homes that night. However, I don't think their families really thought too much of it at the time. They just kind of assumed that they had stayed at the other one's house. So Christine's family just assumed that she was staying at Helen's that night, and Helen's family thought that she may have gone back to Christine's. And remember, this was a time before mobile phones, so it's not like either of the girls could contact their families and let them know where they were. Their families just kind of assumed that they were safe. So they didn't panic too much, although Helen's mother, Margaret, did stay up pretty much all night just in case Helen did come back, but she never did. The following morning, there was still no sign of either of the girls. They still had not returned to their homes, and eventually their families realised that they hadn't stayed at the other one's house. So where were they? What happened to them after they left the pub that night? The families were really concerned at this point because this was not like Christine and Helen. They were two very sensible young girls, so this was very out of character for them. And so because of this, Helen's family decided to go to the Edinburgh police station and report both of the girls as missing. However, later that day, they heard on the radio that a body had been found. At around 2 p.m. on the 16th of October 1977, so the day after Christine and Helen were last seen, two dog walkers were walking along a beach known as Gosford Bay by the East Lothian coastline, which was about 10 miles east of Edinburgh. They were just walking along this beach when they came across the dead, naked body of a young female, and this body would soon be identified as 17-year-old Christine Eady. When Christine was discovered, she was lying on her back, and as I said, she was completely naked. Someone had stripped off her clothes and they had used her tights and her underwear to bound and gag her. She had also been badly beaten, and it was later determined in her autopsy that her cause of death was strangulation, and again she was strangled to death with her own items of clothing. Her killer had fashioned ligatures out of her clothes. Christine had also been raped, and whoever had done this to her hadn't made any attempt whatsoever to hide her body. They had literally just killed her and then dumped her naked body on a public beach, knowing that someone would eventually stumble across this horrific scene. And it didn't take long for her best friend, 17-year-old Helen Scott, to be found either. Later that same day, Helen's body was discovered in a field down a country road, which was just a couple of miles away from where Christine's body was dumped. Helen had also been stripped of her clothes and her shoes were taken off her feet. However, her shoes were never found, and I don't believe they've ever been found to this day. However, she was still wearing her coat, so she was completely naked apart from her coat. Much like Christine, Helen had also been gagged and bound with items of her own clothing, and her killer or killers had used her clothing to make ligatures, and they used these ligatures to strangle her to death. Helen had also been beaten and raped, and just like with Christine, whoever had done this hadn't tried to cover it up. They hadn't tried to hide or conceal her body in any way. So now the police had a double murder inquiry on their hands, and they knew that Christine and Helen's murders had to have been linked. Yes, they were found in different places, but they were both last seen together, and of course the details about their deaths were almost identical. They'd both been raped, both were found naked, and both had been bound and gagged and strangled to death with pieces of their own clothing. So the police knew that they'd both been killed by the same person or people. But who? Who had done this and why? The whole community was just heartbroken when they heard the news that two young girls had been viciously murdered, but they were also just so shocked because back in the 70s when this happened, Edinburgh was thought to be a safe place, not the kind of area where you would expect something as horrific as this to happen. So after the bodies of Helen and Christine had been found, the police immediately began examining the two different crime scenes for any evidence. However, of course, this was back in 1977, and forensic science and forensic technology just wasn't available yet. It wasn't like how it is today where they can pick up the tiniest bit of DNA and that DNA can provide breakthroughs in murder cases such as this one. They were very limited in the kind of forensic techniques they had at their disposal back then. All they could really do at this point was collect any like hair samples and fibers and blood samples, and so that's exactly what they did. They collected all of the evidence that was at the scene, such as the girls' clothing, and they submitted it to scientists, and the scientists began picking up fibers from the clothing and collecting blood samples, and they were also taking swabs from the bodies. But because none of this evidence could tell them anything just yet, they decided to store it and preserve it in the hopes that in the future, when forensic science was more advanced, they would be able to re-examine these pieces of evidence and they would finally offer up some DNA traces of the killer. Meanwhile, as scientists were collecting and preserving all of this evidence, the police decided that they needed to try and track down every single person that had been in the World's End pub that evening, the evening that Christine and Helen were in there. And once they had spoken to other people that were in the pub, they learned that the girls had been in the company of two older guys for most of the night, and eventually they left the pub with them. In fact, the last time Helen and Christine were seen alive, it looked as though they were accompanied by these men. So the police knew that they needed to find them because there was a strong possibility that they were the killers. However, as I mentioned earlier on, no one in the pub seemed to know or recognise these two men. No one had really seen them before, so the detectives knew that identifying them was going to be difficult. Using descriptions given by witnesses, the police created identical pictures and composites of the two men, who were really the two main suspects in this inquiry. And they released these pictures to the public, hoping that someone out there would recognise them and come forward. And over the next year, the police received thousands and thousands of tips and leads from members of the public with information about this case. However, all of these leads were looked into and investigated, but they led nowhere. They just resulted in dead ends. And as a result of this, slowly but surely, this double murder inquiry just started to go cold, because after a while it was like they had nothing left to investigate. They didn't have any more leads or avenues to explore, and they were no closer to identifying the two men that Helen and Christine were with on the night of their murders. But the investigation never really closed, because the detectives involved with this case just refused to give up, and whenever a new tip or lead would come through, the detectives would always look into them, but they would ultimately turn up nothing. The police would go back and they would re-question witnesses and they would check over statements, but for years and years and years, there were practically no developments whatsoever in this case. Now, throughout pretty much this entire investigation, the police believed that there were two people involved in this double murder. They believed that there was two killers because, well, number one, they had countless witnesses come forward saying that Christine and Helen were with two men that night. But also, another reason why they believed two people were responsible for this crime was because of the fact that there were two victims, and it just seemed very unlikely that one person would have been able to overpower two physically fit young girls and strangle them to death. So they always believed that there were two perpetrators. That was until they were eventually able to use forensic science to detect DNA on the evidence they had preserved, such as the girls' clothing and the swabs they had taken. So they tested all of this evidence again, hoping to find traces of the killer's DNA, and the results of these tests actually suggested that only one person was involved in the murders, because scientists could only detect one DNA profile on all of the evidence they had. The DNA evidence they had only seemed to link back to one individual. They didn't have any other forensic or DNA evidence suggesting that a second man was involved in this. So this was kind of a shock to the detectives, but also a relief, because now they finally had a DNA profile of their killer, and so they entered this profile into DNA databases hoping that they would find a match. They thought that whoever had done this must have offended before and had most likely served time in prison for something, because usually murder, a double murder especially, isn't someone's very first crime. So they thought this person's DNA must have been entered into the DNA database at some point. However, unfortunately, there was nothing. No match was found. And this was a huge setback for the police. They were pretty confident that as soon as they had attained a DNA profile of the killer, they would be able to identify him quickly. But there were no matches in the databases. And so this caused the investigation to really slow down again, because leads and developments began to fizzle out. That was until the year 2004, 27 years after the murders, when the police had a breakthrough in this case. Since the murders in 1977, a small piece of material from Helen Scott's coat had been kept and stored in a science lab freezer just in case detectives would need to run tests on it years later. And of course, by this time in the early 2000s, there had been a lot of advancements and improvements in forensic technology. And so a forensic scientist took a small extract of the material from Helen's coat that had semen stains on it, and they conducted some tests. And from this, they were able to determine that there was another person's DNA on it, another man's DNA profile, confirming what the police originally thought, that there were two people involved in these murders. The police had found traces of two different DNA profiles on the evidence. So as we know, as we discussed earlier, the police already put the first DNA profile into the DNA database, and there were no matches. However, now they had a DNA profile of the second male. And so they decided to enter this second profile into the DNA database, and immediately a match came up. After almost 30 years, the police finally had their first proper suspect, a suspect that they could actually link to the crime. And his name was Angus Robertson Sinclair. His semen was found on Helen Scott's coat. But who exactly was Angus Sinclair? At this point in 2004, Angus Sinclair was 59 years old, meaning he would have been around 31 years old at the time of the World's End murders in 1977. And by 2004, he was actually already behind bars. He was already in prison serving a life sentence because he had committed multiple sexual crimes against young girls, and he had also been convicted of 2 murders in his lifetime. So he had already been sent to prison for 2 separate murders, which I'll talk more about in a minute. And now this man was a suspect in the murders of 2 more women, Christine Eady and Helen Scott. And if he was convicted of these murders, that would make him a serial killer. Angus Robertson Sinclair was born in the year 1945 to his parents Mary Sinclair and Angus Sinclair Sr. He had the same name as his father. Angus Jr. was the youngest of 3 siblings. He had an older brother and an older sister, and the Sinclair family lived in Maryhill, which is in Glasgow in Scotland. However, when Angus Jr. was just 4 years old, his father passed away from leukemia, meaning that Mary was now a widower, having to raise 3 children all on her own. And when he died, it seems as though Mary really did struggle to look after her kids. According to her oldest child, John, so Angus's older brother, there wasn't really any parental control after their father passed away. Mary really struggled to discipline her children. But according to a book I read about this case, despite this, Angus still seemed to be pretty well behaved in school. He was of average intelligence, and most people that knew him just described him as being well mannered. Although he was a bit of a loner, he didn't really play and hang out with other kids very much. He kind of just kept himself to himself for the most part. I also think it's important to note that Angus did spend a small part of his childhood in a residential home, although I actually couldn't find a reason for this, why he had to go to this home. And then when he was just 14 years old, Angus Sinclair began committing crimes. He started by committing petty crimes, so he would commit theft and he would break into people's houses and steal things, and he would get caught and be put on probation. but he didn't really care, and he would constantly break the rules of his probation and carry on committing petty crimes. However, in the year 1961, when Angus Sinclair was around 15-16 years old, he started what would become a string of sexual attacks, and his first victim of these attacks would be an 8-year-old girl. This 8-year-old girl lived on the same street as him. Her house was just a few doors down, and one day he sexually assaulted her. He was caught for this, although he denied it ever happening, but nevertheless he lost his job and he was put on probation for 3 years. But this didn't stop Sinclair from doing it again. However, his next assault would also include murder. Just 6 months after the attack on that 8-year-old girl in July of 1961, he killed Catherine Rehill, who was also around 8 years old. Catherine, too, was a neighbour of Sinclair's, and one day he asked her to go to the local corner shop and buy some chocolate for him, and he said that afterwards she could come back to his house and he would give her some money for it. However, as I'm sure you've probably guessed, this was just a way for him to lure Catherine back to his home. His family was out that day. He knew he was going to be home alone, so this was clearly something that he had been planning for a while. As soon as Catherine got back to Sinclair's home that day, he attacked her. He sexually assaulted her and then strangled her to death, making Catherine Rehill his first murder victim. After he had killed Catherine, he picked up her dead body and literally threw her down the stairs, and then he called an ambulance. I think he was hoping that other people would think that Catherine had just accidentally fallen down the stairs and that was how she died. But of course the police could tell from Catherine's injuries that that wasn't the case at all, and Angus Sinclair was charged with murder at just 16 years old. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison for this, although he was eventually released after just 7 years. Following his release from prison, Sinclair got a job as a painter and a decorator, and he even got married. He married a woman named Sarah Hamilton, and they had a child together. So it almost appeared as though he had reformed and was trying to get his life back on track. However, this was all a facade, because he was still committing crimes such as robberies, and he was still sexually assaulting young women and children, usually between the ages of 6 and 14. In fact, he was eventually charged and convicted of 3 rapes and 7 indecent assaults, and when he was examined by a psychiatrist, they stated that Angus Sinclair represented a permanent menace to children. And so in 1982, he was given a life sentence for these sexual assaults because he was just too much of a danger. He posed too much of a threat to young women and children, and so he was locked away. It's believed that Sinclair may have had links to other unsolved murders in Scotland before and after the World's End case, which I'll talk more about a little later on. However, there was one murder that we know he was definitely responsible for, and that was the murder of 17-year-old Mary Gallagher. Mary Gallagher was killed in Glasgow in November of 1978, so just over a year after the World's End murders. She was raped and threatened with a knife before her killer slit her throat, and they also strangled her with pieces of her own clothing, which, as we know, was also the case with the World's End murders. Christine and Helen were also strangled with their clothes. Mary's murder was unsolved for 23 years until 2001, when DNA proved that Angus Sinclair was Mary's killer, and luckily by this point he was already in prison serving his sentence for the sexual assaults he was convicted of. He did try tried to deny Mary's murder, and he said that the reason his DNA was on Mary was because that night, the night that she was killed, the two had consensual sex and that someone else must have killed her afterwards. But of course the jury were not buying it, and he was ultimately found guilty, meaning that in his lifetime so far he had been convicted of a number of sexual assaults and 2 murders. The murder of 8-year-old Catherine Rehill, which he committed when he was a child himself, he was 16, and the murder of Mary Gallagher, which he committed when he was around 32 years old. And then fast forward to 3 years later, in the year 2004, when Angus Sinclair was linked to the World's End case, the murders of Christine Eady and Helen Scott. As we discussed earlier, this was the year that they found his DNA on a semen stain on Helen's coat, the coat that she was wearing on the night that she was killed. However, as we know, the police found 2 DNA profiles on the World's End victims, indicating that there were 2 killers. One of them was Angus Sinclair, but who was the other? The police thought that the second killer must have been someone that Sinclair had a close relationship with and trusted a lot, because obviously if you're going to commit murder with another person, you've got to trust them wholeheartedly. You've got to really believe that they won't ever say anything. So they began going through literally every single male that had ever been in Sinclair's life. So they were looking into his friends and his old workmates. They were looking into criminals that he had been in prison with before the World's End case, and they also looked into his relatives. And after having another look at the DNA profile of the unidentified male, the police realised something very interesting. This DNA profile had common characteristics with Angus Sinclair's wife's male relatives. So if you remember, Angus had a wife called Sarah Hamilton, and she had 5 brothers. And through testing the Y chromosome of this second DNA profile, the police were able to determine that it came from the same paternal line as the 5 brothers of Sarah Hamilton. So the second killer was more than likely one of these brothers. So one by one, the police began testing this profile against the brothers to see if any of them were an exact match, and they were able to rule out 4 of them. They were able to rule out all but 1 brother. The last remaining brother was named Gordon Hamilton. However, by this time in 2004, he was dead. He passed away 8 years earlier in 1996, and this was an issue for the police because they needed his DNA to test against the DNA profile of the second killer. But Gordon Hamilton had been cremated, so they couldn't exhume his body to take a sample from his remains. But the police needed his DNA somehow. They needed to test it against this second profile, and so they asked his family if they had any keepsakes of Gordon's, anything he owned before he died that would have his DNA on it. So for example, a hairbrush or a watch or maybe his wallet, just anything. But the family said no. They said that they didn't have anything that belonged to Gordon in their possession anymore, and so the police had to look elsewhere for Gordon's DNA. The detectives eventually discovered that back in the mid-90s, so not long before Gordon died, he had done some handyman work at a friend's house in Glasgow, where he basically put some coving strips around the edge of one of the ceilings in the house. So the detectives thought that if they went to this house and took this coving strip that Gordon had fitted, they might be able to pick up his DNA from it even after all these years. And so they did exactly that. They went to this house and they took this coving strip back to the lab for testing. And on it, they found traces of DNA. And these traces of DNA were an exact match to the second DNA profile that was obtained from the bodies of the World's End victims. confirming that Gordon Hamilton was involved. He was the second perpetrator that the police have been looking for all these years. Now, there isn't too much information online about Gordon Hamilton that I could find, so I'm just going to run through what I could find about him. Apparently he had an alcohol addiction, and this addiction ultimately contributed to his death in 1996. As reported by a book I read, he and his siblings had a pretty troubled childhood. His father was apparently very domineering and could at times be violent and abusive, and I believe his father was also an alcoholic. When Gordon's sister Sarah married Angus Sinclair, he formed a close relationship with Sinclair himself. They were quite similar in the sense that they both had interests in particularly dark subjects, and they would spend a lot of time together, Angus and Gordon. They would drink together, they would go to pubs, they would go fishing. Now, after they had identified the two killers in the World's End case, the police began thinking that maybe this wasn't the only time these two men, Angus Sinclair and Gordon Hamilton, had committed murder together. We know that Angus had two other murder victims, Catherine Rehill and Mary Gallagher, but could he have committed even more killings with his brother-in-law, Gordon Hamilton? The police quickly set up an operation called Operation Trinity, in which they explored the possibility that Gordon Hamilton and Angus Sinclair could have been linked to other unsolved murders in Scotland, murders that had gone unsolved for years and years. They discovered that in early 1977, Angus Sinclair had purchased a Toyota Caravanette, and one of the reasons why he brought this vehicle was because at the weekends he enjoyed travelling to different parts of Scotland to go fishing and to go to different pubs, and sometimes he would go on his own, but other times his brother-in-law, Gordon Hamilton, would go with him. And I believe Angus had this vehicle for around 3 years, so between 1977 and 1980, Angus would visit various different places in Scotland for his fishing trips. So theoretically, he could kill in these different areas and then travel back home, and the police would never be able to trace him because he would be gone. And when the police looked into unsolved murders from Scotland between 1977 and 1980, they found that a couple of them had a lot of similarities with the World's End murder case, suggesting that they were committed by the same person. The victims of these murders were 37-year-old Frances Barker, 36-year-old Hilda Macaulay, 23-year-old Agnes Cooney, and 20-year-old Anna Kenny. All four women were from different parts of Glasgow, and they were all killed in very similar ways. They had all been sexually assaulted, so these were all sexually motivated crimes, and they had all been tied up and gagged with items of their own clothing before being strangled to death. And then once they were dead, their bodies were just abandoned and left to be discovered by someone else. All of these unsolved murders were pretty much identical. The same methods that Angus Sinclair used in his previous murders had also been used here. So the police firmly believed that they were committed by Angus Sinclair. However, unfortunately, the police could never successfully link Angus Sinclair to any of these murders because they didn't have forensic evidence in the cases of Frances Barker, Hilda Macaulay, Agnes Cooney, and Anna Kenny. Apparently, all of the evidence there was previously in their murder inquiries had either been lost or destroyed. So the police couldn't say for certain whether or not Sinclair was the perpetrator, and so he was never convicted. But most people do believe it was him. They believe that he was responsible for those 4 murders and that he either carried them out on his own or Gordon Hamilton assisted him like he did in the World's End case. Although they didn't have enough evidence to link him to those murders, they did have enough evidence to link him to the murders of Christine Eady and Helen Scott. And so in 2004, the police confronted Angus Sinclair in Peterhead Prison in Scotland, where he was already serving a life sentence for the murder of 17-year-old Mary Gallagher and for other sexual offences. They questioned Sinclair about the World's End case. However, despite the evidence they had against him, and despite the fact that he was already going to be spending the rest of his life behind bars, he denied any involvement in the double murder. He would not give anything up. I say he denied involvement, but actually he didn't say anything. He was interviewed for hours and hours and hours, and he would either just sit in silence or he would say no comment. But to be honest, that didn't really matter to the police. They knew that he was guilty. They knew that he and Gordon Hamilton had done this. Their DNA profiles were on the victims' bodies. Of course, they couldn't charge Hamilton because he was dead, but they could charge Sinclair for the murders of Christine Eady and Helen Scott. And so that's exactly what they did. As expected, Angus pleaded not guilty to the charges, and so the case had to go to trial. And the trial began in August of 2007. Almost 30 years after this case took place. The police theorised that on the evening of the 15th of October 1977, so the night that Helen and Christine were killed, the two 17-year-olds met Gordon Hamilton and Angus Sinclair in the World's End pub. It's believed that after they left the pub, they were either persuaded or forced to get into Sinclair's caravanette, and then they theorised that the two men drove the girls to the Gosford Bay beach, where they raped and killed Christine Eady, and then just left her body there to be found the next day by two dog walkers. The police believe that after they murdered Christine, they then drove Helen Scott to a quiet country road a few miles away, and there she suffered the same fate. She was raped and strangled to death, and then her body was abandoned in a field, and the two men just drove away and escaped detection for years and years. Just as a side note, Sinclair actually later destroyed his Toyota Caravanette, probably so no forensic evidence could ever be found in it. Now, before I go into what happened during Sinclair's trial, I just want to quickly run through the forensic evidence the police had linking him to the murders. So as we know, they had identified him in 2004 through semen stains that were on Helen Scott's coat. Now, the chances of the semen stains belonging to anyone else but Angus Sinclair were 1,000,000,000 to 1. So that was confirmation that they came from him, and that was one thing that linked him to the crime. But scientists also found very small, low-quality traces of DNA on the ligatures fashioned out of the girls' clothing that had been used to tie Christine and Helen up that night. And when they tested this DNA on the ligatures against Angus Sinclair's DNA, it was determined that this time the chances of it being anyone else's DNA other than Sinclair's was 390 to 1. So the odds were a lot less, but it was still more than likely his DNA on the ligatures, and it was more evidence to say that he was involved in the murders. Now, you would think the more evidence the prosecution had to present to the jury, the better. However, one of the prosecutors in this case actually decided that he was not going to present this information about Sinclair's DNA being on the ligatures in court. And the reason he made this decision to throw out this piece of evidence was because he was worried that due to the fact the odds of it being anyone else's DNA apart from Sinclair's were 390 to 1, it would cause doubt in the minds of the jurors. Like I said a minute ago, the odds of the semen stain belonging to anyone other than Sinclair was 1,000,000,000 to 1. So that was very, very damning evidence against him. but the DNA on the ligatures was just 390 to 1. Again, it is more than likely his DNA on the ligatures, but there is a chance that it might not have been, and the prosecutor was concerned that this might sway the jury and make them think twice about convicting Sinclair for these murders. He didn't want to present them any evidence that may have been viewed as circumstantial. He just wanted to present the evidence that was fact, like the semen stains. However, this decision would prove to be the wrong one and would actually work in the defence's favour, because Angus's defence team had thought of a way to try and explain the only damning bit of evidence against him, which was the semen. They claimed that that night, the night that Christine and Helen were murdered, Angus Sinclair and his brother-in-law, Gordon Hamilton, met both of the girls at the World's End pub. They said that the four of them got chatting, and they continued chatting for a while until eventually they all left the pub together. After they left the pub, Angus said that they all went down to the East Coast, and there he had consensual sex with both of the girls. He said he didn't rape them, he had their consent, and that would explain why his semen was on their bodies. And he said that after he had sex with them, he just left, and that when he left, both of the girls were alive. He claimed that he had no part in their murders, and that they must have been murdered after he left by his brother, Gordon Hamilton. And of course, because Gordon Hamilton was dead, he couldn't defend himself, he couldn't give his version of events. And so for all the jury knew, that could have been what happened. And something that I think is important to mention here is that during the trial, the prosecution were not given permission to discuss Sinclair's previous murders and his previous sexual assault convictions. They were not allowed to discuss the fact that Angus Sinclair had raped and killed before, because at the time in Scotland, presenting that kind of evidence was not admissible. So the jury had absolutely no idea about his background, no knowledge of the fact that he was very much capable of committing such an awful act. Now, during the trial, Sinclair's counsel made a submission that under Section 97 of Scotland's Criminal Procedure Act, the defendant in this case, which was Angus Sinclair, had no case to answer to due to the fact that the prosecution did not have enough forensic evidence against him. Yes, his semen was recovered from the bodies, but that only proves that he had sex with them, whether it was consensual or not. It doesn't necessarily prove that he was the one who physically carried out the murders. And so sadly, after this submission, the judge threw the case out, and Angus Sinclair was acquitted in September of 2007. And it turns out that had the prosecution actually presented the evidence of Sinclair's DNA being on the ligatures, then Sinclair's counsel wouldn't have been able to make the submission under the Criminal Procedure Act, because that was evidence to say that he was involved in the actual murder. Why else would his DNA be on the ligatures if he wasn't involved in the killings? Unfortunately, the prosecution made a huge mistake there, not using that piece of evidence. I do understand why they didn't. Like I said earlier, the prosecutor didn't want to present any evidence that may be viewed as circumstantial, but it's just so unfortunate, because had they presented that evidence, the judge wouldn't have been able to throw the case out. The public were furious about the fact that Sinclair had been acquitted of this. This was a man that had a history of sexually assaulting and murdering young women and children, and yet this case was just thrown out. Of course, Sinclair was still going to remain in prison anyway for the murder of Mary Gallagher, but that doesn't mean that justice should not be served in this case. Helen and Christine's families needed justice for their murders. But it seemed as though they were never going to get it now because of double jeopardy laws in the UK. Double jeopardy basically means that once someone has been acquitted of a crime and found not guilty, they can never be tried again on the same charges. So because Angus Sinclair was acquitted, because his case was thrown out, he could never go to trial again for the World's End murders despite all of the evidence against him. However, a lot of people didn't think this law was fair, because what if after a defendant is acquitted, new concrete evidence against them is found that proves they were responsible? It just didn't seem right that just because someone had already been tried before, they can no longer be tried again, especially since, you know, forensic technology is progressing and getting better and better every year. Let's say, for example, someone was tried for murder in the 80s when DNA and forensic science was in its infancy and they were found not guilty due to a lack of evidence. Well, years later, when forensic science was a lot more advanced, scientists may have been able to uncover concrete DNA evidence linking that person to the crime, proving that they were in fact the killer. But despite this, because of the double jeopardy law, they could never go to trial again anyway, and they would just escape capture, allowing them to potentially commit the same crime again. Legal experts just did not think that the double jeopardy law was reasonable. They felt that there were a lot of issues with it, and so they decided to present a case for a change in the law. And it worked. In the year 2011, the Double Jeopardy Scotland Act was passed, meaning that if new and compelling evidence is discovered in a case, suspects can now face a retrial. And as I'm sure you can imagine, the detectives involved in the World's End case were overjoyed with this change in the law, because it now meant that they could work on building a stronger case against Angus Sinclair and hopefully finally get some justice for Christine and Helen. And so, alongside forensic scientists, they began going through all of the evidence they had gathered over the years, because obviously by this point they had even more advanced forensic technology at their disposal, including a new device called Crime Light, which is a light source that can be used to detect DNA. In this case, the scientists used Crime Light to have another look at the ligatures that were fashioned out of Christine and Helen's clothing, the ligatures that had been used during their murders. And they found that there was a lot of Angus Sinclair's DNA and Gordon Hamilton's DNA on the folds of the ligatures, indicating that they hadn't just touched these pieces of clothing, they had actually properly tied the girls up using them. Whereas before they only had a small, low quality amount of Sinclair's DNA on the ligatures, they had now detected a substantial amount of his DNA on it, proving that he hadn't just had sex with the girls that night like he claimed in the first trial. He was actively involved in the murders. So now that the detectives had new evidence in this case, Angus Sinclair was able to go to trial again for the World's End murders, and his second trial began on the 13th of October 2014, and at this time he was 69 years old. During the trial, the prosecution presented all of their evidence to the jury. They didn't leave any of their evidence out this time like they did in the first trial. Every single detail they had about this crime they included in their arguments. Sinclair himself actually decided to take to the stand during his trial, and again he maintained his story that he and Gordon Hamilton had consensual sex with the girls that night, and that he was not involved in what happened to them afterwards. He was not involved in their murders. However, during his cross-examination, one of the prosecutors asked Sinclair some questions about this consensual sex, and he said, Well, how did you know that the girls were consenting? How do you know for certain that you had their consent? And Angus Sinclair's response to this question was just, well, they didn't say no. The second trial went on for around 4 weeks until the 14th of November 2014, when after hearing both the prosecution and the defence, the jury returned to the court with their verdict, and they found 69-year-old Angus Robertson Sinclair guilty of the murders of Christine Eady and Helen Scott, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 37 years, which was exactly how many years it took for him to be convicted. After all that time, after 37 years, Christine and Helen's family finally got the justice they had been waiting for. It just makes me so mad that the second killer, Gordon Hamilton, escaped capture because he passed away before his DNA linked him to the crime. It's just so unfair that he got away with it, but at least Sinclair was eventually convicted for it. As I mentioned earlier on in the video, a lot of people believe that Sinclair was responsible for other unsolved murders in Scotland, particularly the 4 we talked about earlier, the murders of Francis Barker, Hilda Macaulay, Agnes Cooney and Anna Kenny. However, unfortunately, due to a lack of forensic evidence, he has never been convicted for them. And now he never will be, because on the 11th of March 2019, Angus Sinclair passed away in his prison cell at 73 years old. Apparently, he had been having a lot of issues with his health for about 1.5 years before he died, and he had had a series of strokes. But yeah, that is it for this case. That is the case of Christine Eady and Helen Scott. A really sad one, but I'm so glad their families were eventually able to get some justice for their murders. As always, please do let me know your thoughts and opinions on the case in the comments. Do you think Sinclair had more victims, or do you think it was just the 4 he was convicted of in his lifetime? Before I go, I do just want to give a massive shout out to the members of my Patreon page. Thank you so much for your support, guys. If anyone else wants to become a member of our little Patreon family, then the link is always in the description box of my videos. Thank you so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Molly. Bye guys.